Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about strengths and weaknesses of profiles as an assignment or as a structure for courses, particularly writing courses. Generally speaking, I'm a fan of portfolios. I think this is a really good system with a lot of benefits that outweigh some of the drawbacks. But there are some things that you want to consider if you're deciding whether or not you want to adopt a portfolio grading system for your class, or whether you want a more traditional system where students write individual papers that then get grades. So, one of the benefits of a portfolio system is that it really encourages students seeing their writing work as interconnected. So rather than saying, all right, each essay is just a thing in its own right. When I write this rhetorical evaluation, or this researched essay, or this process analysis paper, I'm doing a discrete task. Portfolio learning, portfolio-based classes encourage students to see connections between those essays. Because overall, what students have to produce with a portfolio is an overall picture of themselves, whether that's based on here's what I've learned and how I've improved, whether that's based on here's the range of skills that I can demonstrate, whatever it is. So students have more of an incentive, more of a requirement even, to think about the interconnections between their work, which means that they're more likely, theoretically, they're more likely to transfer skills from one project to another. If you learn about writing a thesis statement in your first project of the semester, students are more likely to carry that through if they see clear connections between the subsequent projects that they do. So this is one real benefit of the portfolio system, is it encourages students to see the work they're doing as a continuum rather than as here's an assignment, here's an assignment, here's an assignment. Another benefit, and this one kind of depends more on how you approach portfolio teaching, because often portfolio classes involve having students do peer review, as you generally want to do in a writing class. But then often students will turn in a draft of a project and get feedback from the instructor, and then do a subsequent round of revisions, drawing from their peer review feedback, but also from what the instructor has said, to produce a final draft for the portfolio. So if that's the approach that you're taking, sometimes people don't do it that way. Sometimes people we'll just say we're doing peer review, and then maybe at the end of the semester, we're going to spend 2 weeks on revision strategies. You'll rework your documents based on all the stuff we've learned over the course of the semester, and then you'll give me the strongest final versions, whatever it is. One way or another, portfolio systems tend to have more time built into them for students to do revisions and to be able to incorporate more knowledge, more rhetorical feedback, more lessons from classes, etc., etc. Whether you as an instructor do the work of giving them feedback on an in-progress draft or not, because the portfolio is typically put together at the end of the semester, the students can they can strengthen their first project from the semester based on stuff that they've learned in the last month of class. So that's a really, really good thing from the student's perspective, because it hopefully means that they can produce better essays by bringing more knowledge to the table as they revise for their final drafts. But it's also actually really good rhetorically in terms of the process of teaching writing, because writing is a process. We go through multiple phases when we write, and so having that ability, having more time built into the structure of a course to do revision, to rethink what you've said, to bring additional knowledge to the essay, etc., etc. All of that is really, really good in terms of enacting the actual writing process, the way that real writers engage with their material. So that's a really, really good thing as well. And then one of the other big benefits of a portfolio system is that it typically, though not necessarily always, it depends on how you set things up, but a portfolio system typically lends itself more to reflection on the student's writing. So, I mean, you may have, like, if you teach in a more traditional style where you have discrete units, you do essay 1, essay 2, essay 3, whatever it is, you may have them do cover letters or cover memos or something like that. You may have them do a reflective project at the end of the semester, whatever it is. But portfolios really have that baked into them. Because, I mean, again, as Nadra Reynolds and Rich Rice talk about in portfolio teaching, one of the main things that characterizes a portfolio is reflection. So portfolios just have that as an element. What are the connections between the materials here? What story does this tell about you as a writer? Like, that's really a fundamental element of putting together a portfolio. And so that structure lends itself to meta-critical or meta-analytical thinking. Having students think about what work they have done, what their writing says about them, about how their writing process works, about their strengths and weaknesses, etc., etc. All of that stuff is really built into a portfolio system in a way that I think is harder to effectively build into a more traditional approach. So those are some of the big benefits of portfolio systems. It helps students see the work that they're doing as consistent and interconnected across the board. It helps them bring a larger amount of knowledge and develop their writing process by going through rounds of revision. And it's more likely to get in-depth reflection from your students. There are some drawbacks to portfolios, however, particularly depending on how you set them up. One thing that students may not like. In the first portfolio system that I taught at University of Vermont, what we did was we got in-progress drafts from students and we gave them feedback on those drafts, but we didn't give them grades on them. And that was a good system pedagogically, because the idea was to not focus on the grade. The grade is not what's important. What's important is learning rhetoric, learning writing, learning composition strategies, etc., etc. It made many students intensely uncomfortable, though, because for as much as we sometimes don't want to acknowledge it, grades are important to students. They do matter to students. And not getting those in-progress grades, not getting grades on the essays themselves, really made students unsure of where they stood in the class. So that was one big drawback with that particular system. Now, when I taught at WVU, we didn't do it that way. We put in-progress grades on essays. And the good thing about that was that the final draft could be improved. So basically the way that we had to try and convince students to look at those in-progress grades was, if you turned in this draft, this is the grade that it would earn. And that's a bit of a weird thing. So this was actually the pitfall of the WVU system, because it was a portfolio grade ultimately, because it was a grade on the body of work that they were going to produce. What exactly the relationship was between this essay has this grade and the portfolio grade was not necessarily super intuitive. So grading can be a really tricky thing with portfolios depending on how you approach it. And I think in any system that you approach it, there's likely to be some gray area, and there's likely to be some things that students are going to have trouble processing, in part because a writing portfolio system is likely to be very different than any type of grading they've experienced before. So it won't feel natural to them in the way that, like, I've taken an exam and I've gotten an 87 on it will feel very natural to them. Or I've written this essay and I've gotten an A-. That will make perfect sense to them, and this essay is worth 15% of my overall grade. That will make perfect sense to them. Portfolio grading, because there's different moving parts that are all sort of interconnected, students often don't have a schema in their mind to really make easy sense of that. So that's one issue. Portfolios can also put a lot more labor on an instructor. So again, there's different ways of approaching this and shaping your assignment sequence, shaping what your course requires. If you are collecting in-progress drafts and giving students feedback on those papers, that they can then take that feedback and revise for the final portfolio, you have to do that round of feedback. Now, that's not necessarily super, super difficult, because if your alternative is a traditional course where you're giving feedback and a grade on every essay anyway, you're still giving that feedback. But because you are giving the feedback on the in-progress draft and then would be giving feedback on the final portfolio, that's another round of feedback that you have to do. And so that's one additional task that portfolio grading can put on your plate. One other concern in terms of grading, and this is actually related to the sort of lack of clarity for students about how the grading for this may work, especially if students are allowed to choose what pieces to incorporate into their final portfolio, you have to come up with a grade that is fair to the student and fair to and fair in the grand context of the class, fair in terms of program requirements, with portfolios that may have different pieces in them. So, I mean, when you give, for instance, a rhetorical evaluation assignment, you know that every essay that gets turned in is going to be a rhetorical evaluation, or it will get an F. And you know how to assess a rhetorical evaluation. Like, you know what you look for in that essay to make it successful, to make it an A paper, B paper, C paper, D paper, F paper. When it's a portfolio and the students get to say, all right, I want to include this essay, but not this essay, and I want to include this poster that I made, and I want to include these short rights, that's great. But then you have to have a consistent grading standard when you stack that up against a student who doesn't include the first paper, but includes the second paper. Maybe who doesn't include any short rights, but they include their portfolio, their poster project and the video project that they did. Or they include just three essays or whatever it is. You have to figure out a way to grade fairly and consistently when you're getting various materials. You also have to figure out how you're weighting different components of this. How much is the reflective component going to count? Like, if the student just has a third of a page reflection written at the beginning as a cover memo or something like that, is that as good as a student who's done a full page of reflection before every piece that they include, every essay, every short write, every whatever it is? How much does that reflective component weigh versus the quality of the written work itself? So you need to figure out a way of assessing fairly, consistently, accurately, and equally collections of documents that may include different things and may take very different approaches. So, I mean, these are some of the things to be thinking about when you're trying to decide whether or not you want to use a portfolio system in your course. Obviously, if you teach in a program that says you have to use a portfolio system or you can't use a portfolio system, the decision is out of your hands. But if you get to make that choice, these are some of the things that you want to think about, along with just generally, how comfortable are you as an individual instructor teaching a portfolio course or teaching a more traditional course? What is your experience? What is your confidence level? What is your competency, etc., etc.?